Listen here, child. Gather round this old fire that's been burning since before your granddaddy's granddaddy drew first breath. I's a voice from the deep waters, from them dark holds where our people crossed over on vessels of death, packed like logs, breathing each other's last prayers. Tonight, I tell you about a man named Dred Scott, a man who walked through the whipping post's shadow, who tasted free soil and had it snatched back, whose ribs was split open by the overseer's lash till you could count every bone the good Lord gave him. They say he drowned that devil Harlan in the muddy Mississippi, wrapped them same chains that bound our people round that cruel neck, and watched the bubbles rise. This ain't no tale from fancy books, no sir. This is blood memory, passed down in whispers at the quarters, sung in coded spirituals when the master slept. So lean in close, 'cause what I's about to tell you happened in the belly of America's sin, where cotton grew white on black suffering, and justice was a word that never crossed no slave's lips without tasting like ashes. In them days of deep sorrow, before Dred Scott ever felt the whip's kiss on his own back, there was his grandmama Ajari. Lord have mercy on her soul. She was ripped from the coast of West Africa, from a village where the drums spoke at twilight and the elders knew every ancestor's name back to the first rains. The year was 1769, and she was barely 14 summers old when them slave catchers came in the night, burning thatch roofs and dragging folks in chains through red clay paths that led to the sea. Old folks say Ajari fought like a wildcat. She bit one trader's hand so deep he carried the scar till his dying day. But what's one girl 'gainst guns and greed? They threw her in the belly of a ship called the Blessing. Though what blessing ever came from such a cursed vessel, only the devil knows. Down there in that floating coffin, packed tight with 200 souls, the stench was thick enough to choke on. Vomit, blood, seawater, death. Folks died every day, sometimes 2 or 3, and the crew just tossed them overboard like they was spoiled cargo. Ajari survived that middle passage, though pieces of her soul stayed in them dark waters. She'd wake up screaming for the rest of her life, dreaming of drowned faces floating past her in the gloom. When the ship docked in Charleston, South Carolina, she stepped onto American soil chains, still heavy on her ankles, and was marched straight to the auction block on Market Street. Now listen here, child. The auction block was hell's own stage. White men in fine coats gathered round, poking and prodding at human flesh like they was buying livestock. They pried open Ajari's mouth to check her teeth, felt her arms to test her strength. The auctioneer, a red-faced man with tobacco-stained whiskers, hollered out, "Strong-backed wench, good breeder, what am I bid?" The bidding went fast. A plantation owner from Virginia named Samuel Scott won her for 60 pounds sterling. Just like that, a life reduced to coin. Ajari was loaded onto a wagon with 5 other enslaved souls and carried inland to a tobacco plantation near Petersburg. The journey took 3 days through forests so thick the Spanish moss hung like the hair of hanged ghosts. At the Scott plantation, Ajari learned what suffering really meant. Up before dawn to tend tobacco fields under a skinning heat that made the air shimmer like water. The overseer, a cruel-hearted man named Cobb, walked the rows with a whip called Persuader, 9 tails of leather that could strip flesh from bone. Any slave caught restin' got 5 lashes. Any slave who talked back got 10. Any slave who ran, Lord have mercy, they got the dog pack and the noose. Ajari bore children into this misery. 3 of them, 2 boys sold away before they could walk. 1 girl named Bethany who survived. She never knew their daddy's names. Some was forced on her by the master. Some was her choosing what little love she could grab in a loveless world. But every child she birthed, she whispered the same prayer over. Remember who you is. Remember we was free once. Remember Africa. Bethany grew up strong-willed, which was both gift and curse. She married a man named Old Randall, and together they had a boy child born in 1799. A boy they named Dred, though some say his birth name was Sam. This boy would grow up to shake the nation's very foundations. Ajari lived to see Dred take his first steps. She was old by then, maybe 65, maybe 70. Nobody kept proper count of slave ages. Her back was bent like a willow switch, her hands gnarled from decades of labor. But her eyes still carried that African fire, that memory of drums and freedom. One winter night in 1810, when Dred was about 11, Ajari called him to her pallet in the slave quarters. The quarters was a row of wooden shacks with dirt floors, gaps in the walls wide enough for wind to cut through. Families huddled together for warmth, burning whatever scraps of wood they could find. "Boy," Ajari whispered, her voice crackling like dry leaves. "Come close now." Dred crawled to her side. Even in the dim firelight, he could see she was fading. That look in her eyes, like she was already seeing the other side. "You listen good," she said, gripping his small hand with surprising strength. "I crossed the big water. I survived what killed so many. You got that blood in you. Survivor's blood. Don't never forget where we come from. Don't never bow your head so low you can't see the North Star. You hear me?" "Yes, Grandmama," Dred whispered, tears streaming down his face. "They can chain the body, but they can't chain the spirit less you let them." She coughed and blood flecked her lips. "Promise me you'll remember." "I promise." That night, Ajari crossed over. They buried her the next morning in the slave cemetery beyond the tobacco fields. No marker, no proper funeral, just a shallow grave covered with red Virginia clay. Master Scott didn't even stop the work. The slaves sang her home with a low spiritual that drifted across the fields. "Wade in the water. Children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." But the true trouble came that very afternoon. Young Dred was working alongside his mama Bethany, picking the last of the tobacco leaves. The overseer Cobb was in a foul mood, whiskey on his breath, rage in his eyes. He saw an older slave named Isaiah stoop down to catch his breath, and that was all it took. "Get up, you lazy dog," Cobb roared. Isaiah tried, but his legs gave out. He was maybe 50, ancient for a field hand, wore down to nothing. What happened next burned itself into Dred's memory like a brand. Cobb ordered Isaiah tied to the whipping post, a thick oak tree at the edge of the field. Two other slaves, compelled by fear, bound Isaiah's wrists with rope and pulled him high. 20 lashes for laziness," Cobb announced. The whip sang through the air. Once, twice. By the 5th strike, Isaiah's back was ribbons of meat. By the 10th, he'd stopped screaming. By the 20th, he hung limp, unconscious, or dead. Hard to tell which. Dred stood frozen, his child's eyes forced to witness what awaited all of them. His mama pulled him close, her hand over his mouth to keep him from crying out. "Don't look away," she whispered fierce in his ear. "You look and you remember. You remember what they is." When Cobb finally cut Isaiah down, the old man crumpled to the ground. They dragged him back to the quarters and left him on the floor to heal or die. The master didn't care which. That night, as Dred lay on his pallet, he heard his mama crying quiet in the dark. Outside, somewhere in the Virginia darkness, an owl called. A sound the old one said meant death was prowling near. Dred touched the space where his grandmama had slept. Her words echoed in his head. "They can chain the body, but they can't chain the spirit." He thought of Isaiah's torn back. He thought of the whipping post waiting. He thought of the auction block where his uncles had been sold. And deep in his child's heart, a question formed that would haunt him all his days. When will my turn come? The answer, child, was closer than he knew. 5 years done passed, and Dred Scott growed from boy to young man under the weight of bondage. He was 16 now in the year 1815, his body hardened by endless labor, but his spirit still carrying that spark his grandmama Ajari planted. The Scott plantation had changed hands. Master Samuel Dunn died, and his son Peter Blow bought several of the slaves, including Dred's family, moving them to Alabama where cotton was the new king. Peter Blow weren't the cruelest master. He didn't whip for sport or sell families apart without reason, but he was still a master, and that meant he owned human souls like they was mules or plows. His plantation sprawled across the red clay hills near Huntsville, hundreds of acres planted in cotton that needed picking from sunup to sundown. It was on this plantation that Dred first laid eyes on Harriet Robinson. Lord of glory, she was something special, barely 15 years old, with eyes that held both fire and sorrow, skin dark as polished mahogany, and a spirit that wouldn't break easy. She belonged to a neighboring plantation owned by Major Taliaferro, but sometimes the slaves from different plantations crossed paths at Sunday gatherings, them rare hours when the masters allowed them to attend praise house services. The first time Dred saw Harriet, she was singing a spiritual with such power the very air seemed to tremble. "Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." Their eyes met across that crowded praise house, and something passed between them. A recognition maybe, or a promise. After the service, Dred managed to speak with her for just a moment. "You sing like the angels themselves, Jealous," he said, his voice rough with shyness. Harriet smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Ain't no angels watching over us, brother. Just each other." "Then I'll watch over you," Dred said, surprised by his own boldness. "Big promise for a young buck to make," Harriet replied, but her eyes softened. "What's your name?" "Dred. Dred Scott." "Well, Dred Scott, you best be careful making promises you might not can keep." But Dred meant every word. From that day forward, they found ways to see each other. Stolen moments in the woods between plantations, quick conversations at the creek where water was fetched, glances exchanged at the market when masters brought their slaves to town. It couldn't last peaceful. It never could. The trouble came in the form of a man named Josiah Harlan, the new overseer Peter Blow hired in 1816. Now listen here, child. Harlan was mean as sin and twice as ugly. He was a poor white man from Georgia who'd failed at farming and turned to overseeing as a way to lord power over somebody, anybody. He stood 6 feet tall, thin as a rail, with pale eyes that held no mercy and a mouth that never smiled, except when he was hurting somebody. Harlan took one look at Dred, strong, proud, with that light in his eyes that spoke of inner freedom, and decided to break him. It started small. Extra work assignments, shorter rations, public humiliations. Harlan would walk the cotton fields with his whip, a nine-tail called Old Testament, and he'd crack it near Dred's head just to watch him flinch. "You think you special, boy?" Harlan hissed one day, his tobacco breath hot on Dred's face. "You think that head of yours got thoughts that matter? You ain't nothing but property, less than a mule. At least a mule don't got delusions." Dred bit his tongue, tasted blood, but said nothing. The old ones had taught him. Don't give 'em reason. Keep your head down. Survive. But pride is a hard thing to swallow, and Dred had his grandmama's blood. The breaking point came on a July afternoon in 1817, when the heat was so thick you could barely breathe. Dred was working his row of cotton, his hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, when he heard a commotion from the overseer's shed. It was Harriet. Harlan had caught her sneaking across the property line to see Dred. Now he had her by the arm, dragging her toward the whipping post. "Trespassing slave," Harlan shouted. "Gonna teach you to stay where you belong." Dred dropped his sack and ran, his heart thundering like drums in his chest. "She weren't doing no harm," he called out. "Please, sir, it was my fault. I asked her to come." Harlan spun around, his pale eyes glittering with malice. "That so? Well then, boy, you can take her lashes for her." A crowd of slaves had gathered, forced to witness. Master Blow came out of the big house drawn by the noise, but he didn't intervene. In his eyes, this was the overseer's business. They tied Dred to the post. He could see Harriet's face in the crowd, tears streaming, her mouth open in a silent scream. He wanted to tell her it was all right, that he'd bear it for her, but the first lash stole his voice. Old Testament sang its devil's song. The leather bit into Dred's back, tearing through his shirt, splitting skin. Fire exploded across his shoulders. He clenched his teeth till he thought they'd crack. 1. Harlan counted. Another strike. Blood ran hot down Dred's spine. 2. The pain was beyond description, child. Like being burned and frozen at once, like your very soul was being flayed. By the 5th lash, Dred's vision blurred. By the 10th, he was biting through his own lip. But he didn't scream. He wouldn't give Harlan that satisfaction. "Stubborn buck," Harlan muttered, breathing hard from the exertion. "We'll see how long that lasts." When they finally cut him down after 20 lashes, Dred collapsed. His back was a mess of torn flesh and blood. The other slaves carried him to the quarters, where the old root woman, Mama Celia, tended his wounds with herbs and prayers. "You lucky you ain't dead," Mama Celia murmured, packing his wounds with a poultice of comfrey and spider webs. "That devil was trying to kill you. Better me than her," Dred whispered through the haze of pain. Harriet stayed by his side that night, slipping across the property line in the dark, risking another beating. She held his hand and sang soft spirituals while fever burned through him. "You a fool," she whispered, tears in her voice. "A beautiful, stubborn fool." "Had to protect you," Dred managed. "And who gonna protect you? Maybe one day we both be free. Won't need protecting then." It was a child's dream, but in that moment, in the dark of the slave quarters with his back torn open, it was all they had. But the world had other plans. 2 weeks later, after Dred had barely healed, Master Peter Blow made an announcement. He was moving his operations to St. Louis, Missouri, and he was taking most of his slaves with him. But not all. Some would be sold to cover debts. Dred's name was on the list to be sold. They came for him at dawn, while dew still clung to the cotton plants. Harlan himself supervised, a cruel smile on his thin lips. They bound Dred's wrists and loaded him onto a wagon with 6 other slaves. Harriet ran from the neighboring plantation when she heard, her feet bare and bloody from the red clay path. She reached the wagon just as it started to roll. "Dred!" she screamed, her voice raw with anguish. He looked back at her, his eyes memorizing every detail of her face, the curve of her jaw, the tears on her cheeks, the way her hands reached out toward him as if she could pull him back through sheer will. "I'll find you," he shouted over the rattle of chains and wagon wheels. "I swear on my grandmama's grave I'll find you." The wagon pulled away, dust rising in its wake. The last thing Dred saw was Harriet sinking to her knees in the middle of the road, her mouth open in a wail that seemed to tear the very sky. The chains around his wrists clinked with every bump in the road, a sound that would haunt him for years to come. The sound of bondage, the sound of separation, the sound of a promise he didn't know if he could keep. In the wagon bed, surrounded by other frightened souls, Dred touched the scars on his back, Harlan's signature written in torn flesh. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and pain, a seed of rage took root. One day, he thought, one day there'll be a reckoning. But that day was still far off, and the road ahead was long and cruel. The wagon rolled on toward St. Louis, toward an unknown future, while behind them, Harriet's cries faded into the Alabama morning like a spiritual sung too soft to hear. "Now listen here, child. Fate works in mysterious ways, even in the belly of bondage. That wagon that carried Dred away from Harriet in Alabama didn't lead straight to perdition. No, sir. It led to a man named Dr. John Emerson, a Army surgeon stationed in St. Louis who bought Dred from Peter Blow's estate in 1830. Dr. Emerson was a peculiar sort of master, educated, refined, but still a slaveholder through and through. He saw Dred as useful property, a strong-backed man who could serve as personal attendant, cook, and general laborer. But what Emerson didn't count on was where the Army would send him next. In 1833, Dr. Emerson received orders to Fort Armstrong in Illinois. Illinois, a free state where slavery was prohibited by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. When Dred crossed that Mississippi River into Rock Island, something shifted in the very air he breathed. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a whisper of possibility. The fort sat on an island where the Rock River met the Mississippi, surrounded by limestone bluffs and thick forests. The soldiers, white men in blue uniforms, didn't own slaves. The civilians Dred encountered spoke of freedom like it was real, tangible, not some far-off dream sung in spirituals. "You know you's on free soil?" an old black man named Samuel told Dred one afternoon at the fort's supply depot. Samuel was a free man, working for wages, living in his own cabin with his wife and children. What that mean exactly? Dred asked, his voice cautious. Hope was a dangerous thing for a slave to carry. Means legally you free. Illinois don't recognize slavery. Any slave brought here by his master got claim to freedom. Sweet Jesus. Them words hit Dred like lightning. But Samuel shook his head, seeing the spark in Dred's eyes. Don't mean much if you got no way to prove it in court, brother. And don't mean nothing if your master take you back south before you can file papers. The law's a twisted vine. Grows one way for white folks, another for us. Still, Dred breathed that free air. He walked them Illinois paths knowing that under his feet was land where bondage held no legal power. The taste of it was sweeter than honey, more intoxicating than whiskey. But the real miracle came in 1836, when Dr. Emerson got reassigned again, this time to Fort Snelling in the Wisconsin Territory, another free jurisdiction. And it was there, in that northern outpost where winters froze the Mississippi solid and summers blazed with wildflowers, that Dred's life took a turn toward the light. Harriet was there. Lord have mercy, child. After 9 years of separation, after Dred had carried her face in his memory through every long night, there she stood at the fort's laundry, washing officers' uniforms in a great iron kettle. She'd been sold to a Major Taliaferro, the same man who'd owned her in Alabama, and he'd brought her north when he too got stationed at Fort Snelling. When Dred saw her, his heart near bout stopped beating. "Harriet," he whispered, afraid she was a conjure vision, a trick of his lonely mind. She turned, her hands still soapy, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Dred Scott? That really you, or am I dreaming with my eyes open?" They fell into each other's arms right there, tears mixing with laughter. 9 years of grief pouring out in that embrace. The other laundry women smiled knowing smiles. Love was rare enough in this world, and when it survived, it deserved witnessing. From that day forward, Dred courted Harriet proper, with Dr. Emerson's permission. They walked the bluffs overlooking the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers. They attended services at the fort's chapel. They spoke of dreams they'd never dared voice before. "We's on free soil," Dred told her one twilight, the sky painted purple and gold. "Both of us. Illinois, Wisconsin Territory. Slavery ain't legal here, but we still belong to masters," Harriet said, ever the practical one. "Free soil don't mean free people, not while they can haul us back south. Then we stay here. We make our stand." In 1837, they married. A real wedding, sanctioned by the fort's chaplain, witnessed by soldiers and officers. Harriet wore a simple cotton dress dyed indigo blue. Dred wore his best shirt, patched but clean. When the chaplain said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," it felt like the first truly legitimate thing that had ever happened to either of them. Their first child, a daughter they named Eliza, was born in 1838 on that free soil of Fort Snelling. Dred held that tiny baby in his calloused hands and wept like a child himself. Here was innocence, here was possibility, here was a life born where slavery had no dominion. "She free," he whispered to Harriet as they lay in their small quarters behind the fort's kitchens. "Born free on free land. They can't never take that from her." "Can't they?" Harriet's voice carried the weight of knowing better. "Dred, you think the white man's law gonna protect a black baby just 'cause she born in the right place? Law's just words on paper, and paper burns." But Dred wanted to believe, needed to believe. For 2 years at Fort Snelling, he lived in a kind of dream. Working for Emerson but breathing free air, married legal, raising a daughter who toddled through northern meadows picking wildflowers. Then came 1840, and the dream shattered like glass. Dr. Emerson received orders back to Missouri, slave territory where the air was thick with cotton and the crack of whips. And he intended to bring his property with him, Dred, Harriet, and little Eliza. The night before they were to depart, Dred sat by the Mississippi, watching the current flow south toward St. Louis. Harriet sat beside him, holding Eliza, who slept peaceful in her arms. "We could run," Dred said quiet, his voice barely carrying over the water's whisper. "Slip away north. There's folks would help us reach Canada. With a baby, through winter territory, They'd set dogs on us, Dred. Bounty hunters don't care about free soil once you's a runaway. So we just go back to being property, back to the auction block and the whipping post. Harriet was silent a long moment, then said, "No, we go back but we fight, legal-like. You lived on free soil for years, so did I. That got to count for something in the courts." "The courts?" Dred laughed bitter. "Harriet, them courts is run by white men who own slaves themselves." "Maybe, but it's the only weapon we got that don't end with us dead or separated forever. We fight their way, with their laws, and we make 'em see the contradiction. You was owned by a man who brought you to free states. That makes you free by their own rules. It was a gamble, a long shot, a hope built on the shakiest foundation. But it was something." The next morning, they boarded the steamboat Gypsy, bound for St. Louis. As the paddle wheels churned and the boat pulled away from Fort Snelling, Dred looked back at them bluffs where he'd known something close to freedom. Little Eliza pointed at the receding shore. "Home?" she asked in her tiny voice. Dred's throat tightened. "Home's wherever we is, baby girl, long as we together." But as Missouri's slave territory swallowed them up again, as the air grew thick with the old familiar Dred made himself a promise. He would fight. Not with fists or weapons, not yet, but with law, with words, with the very system that enslaved him. He didn't know then that his fight would reach the highest court in the land. Didn't know his name would echo through history. Didn't know the price he'd pay was written in blood and broken ribs. All he knew was the taste of free soil still lingered on his tongue, and he'd be damned if he'd let it fade without a fight. The Gypsy steamed south, carrying the Scott family back toward the jaws of bondage, while behind them, the free territories disappeared into morning mist, like a dream you can't quite hold on to when you wake. Missouri in 1840 was a cauldron boiling with tension, child. It was a slave state clinging to bondage, while free states surrounded it like a noose tight and slow. St. Louis sat on the western edge of slavery's kingdom, a bustling river city where steamboats belched smoke, where auction blocks stood on courthouse steps, where human beings was bought and sold like sacks of grain. When Dred, Harriet, and little Eliza stepped off that steamboat onto St. Louis's cobblestone levee, the weight of bondage settled back on their shoulders like iron yokes. The air tasted different here, thick with coal smoke, river mud, and the stench of the slave pens near the waterfront where traders kept their merchandise before auction. Dr. Emerson had returned to establish his medical practice, but he didn't keep Dred and his family with him. No, sir. He hired them out to other white folks, a common practice that let masters profit from slave labor without the daily burden of ownership. Dred was hired out to work at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Russell. Harriet was sent to a different household to cook and clean. Little Eliza stayed with her mama, clinging to Harriet's skirts while she scrubbed floors and stirred pots. The separation was knife-sharp. Dred could only see his wife and child on Sunday afternoons, them precious few hours when hired-out slaves was allowed to visit family. He'd walk across town, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, just to hold Harriet's hand and watch Eliza play in a patch of dirt behind the kitchen. "This ain't livin'," Harriet whispered one Sunday, her voice thick with tears. "This is just surviving day by day." "I know," Dred said, his jaw tight, "but we gonna change it. Remember what you said. We fight legal-like." Words is easy, Dred, action's hard. But before they could act, fate twisted the knife deeper. In December 1843, Dr. Emerson died sudden of pneumonia. He was barely 40 years old. His widow, Irene Emerson, inherited everything, including Dred, Harriet, and their children. By now, they had a second daughter, Lizzie, born in 1840. Dred approached the widow respectfully, hat in hand, hope cautious in his chest. "Ma'am, I'd like to propose something. I've been working steady, saving what little I can. I'd like to buy my family's freedom. Name your price and I'll work to pay it." Widow Emerson looked at him like he'd spoken in tongues. "Buy your freedom. Dred, you're worth at least $1,000. Harriet and the children another 1,000. Where would you get such money?" "I'd work for it, ma'am, however long it takes." "And what would I do for labor in the meantime?" "No, Dred. The answer is no." Just like that, a lifetime of servitude affirmed with 2 words: No explanation, no consideration, just the cold arithmetic of property value. Worse still, Widow Emerson hired Dred out to a man named Captain Bainbridge, who ran a plantation outside St. Louis where tobacco and hemp was grown. And Bainbridge had an overseer, a thin, mean-eyed devil who'd come up from Alabama, Josiah Harlan. Lord have mercy on us all, but that snake had followed Dred across the years like a curse. When Dred first saw him standing in the plantation yard, whip coiled at his belt, that old scar tissue on his back started burning like fresh wounds. "Well, well," Harlan said, his pale eyes glittering with malice. "If it ain't Dred Scott. Heard you been up north tasting that free air, filling your head with notions. We gonna beat them notions out real quick." The torment started that very day. Harlan assigned Dred the hardest tasks: plowing fields behind a mule that was half lame, hauling water from a creek a mile away, splitting cord after cord of firewood. And when Dred worked, Harlan watched, waiting for any excuse. It came on a February morning in 1844, cold enough that frost crusted the ground. Dred was plowing a rocky field, the blade catching on stones, the mule balking. Progress was slow, and Harlan's patience, never thick to begin with, ran out. "You slowing down on purpose, boy?" Harlan called from his horse. "No, sir, the ground's just—" The whip cracked before Dred could finish, catching him across the shoulders. Even through his thick coat, the pain was sharp, immediate. "Don't make excuses. Work faster." Another crack, then another. Harlan was working himself into a rage, that familiar bloodlust rising in his eyes. He dismounted and advanced on Dred with Old Testament in his hand, that nine-tailed devil that had scarred Dred years before. "Strip off that coat," Harlan ordered. "Time for a reminder of who you belong to." Dred's hands trembled, not with fear but with barely controlled rage. Every instinct screamed to fight back, to wrap his strong hands around that scrawny neck and squeeze. But he knew what resistance brought: the noose, the dogs, the funeral. So he stripped off his coat and stood before the whipping tree, a scarred oak at the field's edge. They bound his wrists with rope and pulled them high, stretching him up on his toes. Other hired slaves was forced to watch. Always the same cruel ritual, breaking one to terrify the rest. The first lash tore through Dred's shirt and opened skin. He bit down on his own tongue, tasted copper. "Count 'em," Harlan hissed. "I want to hear you count everyone." "One," Dred gasped. The second lash crossed the first, creating a bloody X on his back. 2. By the 5th stroke, his shirt hung in shreds. By the 10th, blood ran down into his breeches. By the 15th, his back was a geography of pain, each lash a river cutting through scarred land. 15, Dred whispered, his voice barely there. Harlan paused, breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion and perverse pleasure. "You think you special 'cause you been north? You think them free states made you something other than property? You are nothing." Each word was punctuated with another lash. 16, 17, 18. When they finally cut Dred down, he collapsed into the frozen mud, his back screaming agony. The other slaves carried him to a shed where he lay face down on a pile of burlap sacks, shivering despite the fire they built. That night, an old root woman named Aunt Hattie came to tend him. She packed his wounds with a poultice of plantain leaves, spiderwebs, and whiskey, muttering prayers in a language half African, half English. "That devil mean to kill you slow," she said. "He got a hatred in him older than this plantation." "I know," Dred whispered through clenched teeth. "You got to be careful, son. Hatred like that don't stop till one of you is in the ground." Aunt Hattie leaned close, her ancient eyes reflecting firelight. "But I tell you something. The river remembers. The river's been drinking blood and tears since before any of us was born. One day the river gonna ask for payment, you hear me?" Dred heard. Oh, he heard clear as church bells. As fever burned through him and pain made sleep impossible, Dred's mind turned to dark places. He thought of Harlan's thin neck. He thought of the Mississippi River just 3 miles away, its muddy waters deep and cold. He thought of heavy chains sinking slow. And for the first time in his life, Dred Scott, who'd always fought to stay within the lines, who'd believed in legal remedy and moral persuasion, began to understand the language of vengeance. Outside the shed, the Missouri night pressed heavy and cold. Somewhere in the darkness, a hound howled, and deep in Dred's torn back, alongside the pain, something new was growing, a seed of rage that would bloom red as blood. The overseer had sung his whip's song. Now the whip's answer was coming. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but sure as the river flows to the sea, retribution was waiting in the shadows, patient as death itself. The winter of 1845 was cruel even by Missouri's standards, child. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the plantation in white that looked pure but covered nothing but misery. Dred's back had healed some, but the scars ran deeper than flesh. They carved into his soul, changing something fundamental in the man he'd been. In the slave quarters at night, huddled around smoky fires built in crude hearths, the enslaved folk whispered stories that the masters prayed they'd never hear. Stories of Nat Turner down in Virginia, who'd seen visions from God and led a rebellion that killed 60 white folks before they hanged him. Stories of Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey, of uprisings crushed but never forgotten. An old man named Solomon, blind in one eye from a master's fist, spoke in low tones that carried the weight of scripture. The books say Moses told Pharaoh, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh's heart was hard, so God sent plagues, blood in the water, death of the firstborn. Sometimes freedom don't come from asking polite. Sometimes it come from the angel of death passing through. Dred listened, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. Before, such talk would have scared him. The white man's retribution was swift and merciless. But now, with his back carrying Harlan's signature and scars, with his wife and daughters still held in bondage despite years on free soil, something in him had shifted like tectonic plates before an earthquake. The quarters at night became a hush harbor of sorts, where spirituals was sung with coded meanings. Wade in the water, warned of dogs that couldn't track through streams. Follow the drinking gourd pointed to the North Star. Steal away to Jesus meant midnight meetings in the woods, where plans was whispered and fury was stoked. But what really fed the fire in Dred's belly was seeing what they threatened to do to his daughters. Eliza was 7 now, Lizzie 5. Beautiful children with their mama's fierce eyes and their daddy's stubborn spirit. They lived with Harriet at the boarding house in St. Louis, but rumors reached Dred that Widow Emerson was considering selling one of them to settle debts. The thought of his baby girl on an auction block, standing where he'd seen his own uncles sold, where families was torn apart like paper dolls. It made his blood run cold, then boiling hot. He traveled to St. Louis on a rare Sunday pass, found Harriet in the kitchen of Mrs. Russell's boarding house, and pulled her aside. "Tell me it ain't true," he said, his voice shaken. "Tell me they ain't fixing to sell Lizzie." Harriet's face crumbled. "I heard the widow talking to a trader. He offered $400 for her, said she'd fetch good money in New Orleans. Pretty little girl. Train her up as a house servant or..." She couldn't finish, but they both knew. Pretty girls sold in New Orleans sometimes ended up in the fancy houses, the brothels where enslaved women was used till they was used up. Dred's hands clenched into fists so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. "Over my dead body. Might come to that," Harriet whispered. "You can't fight them, Dred. They got the law, the guns, the dogs. Then we use they own law against them," Dred said, the idea crystallizing. "We sue for our freedom. We was in free territory for years. Illinois, Wisconsin. By they own rules, that makes us free. We get the courts to see it." Harriet looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Black folks don't win in white courts." "Maybe not, but we got to try. 'Cause the alternative," he looked at his daughters playing in the corner, innocent and unaware. "I can't watch 'em sell my babies, Harriet. I can't watch 'em take you. I'll die first. I'll kill first." The words hung heavy in the air. They both knew what he meant. Violence was a door that once opened, couldn't be closed. But sometimes that door was all that stood between you and hell itself. Before they could act on the legal plan, Harlan struck again. It was March, early spring, when the ground was soft with thaw. Dred was working in the plantation's tobacco shed, hanging leaves to cure, when Harlan came in, whiskey on his breath and that familiar hunger in his pale eyes. "Heard you been talking sedition in the quarters," Harlan said, circling Dred like a predator. "Heard you been filling the other slaves' heads with notions of freedom." "I ain't said nothing but prayers, sir." "Don't lie to me, boy. I got eyes everywhere. You think you special? Think them years up north changed what you is?" Harlan pulled Old Testament from his belt. "Strip." "Sir, I ain't done nothing." The whip cracked across Dred's chest, tearing through his shirt. "I said strip." This time was worse than before. This time, Harlan was drunk and angry, taking out frustrations that had nothing to do with Dred and everything to do with his own failed life. He beat Dred with a fury that went beyond punishment. It was an attempt to break not just body but spirit. The lash fell 20 times, 30, 40. By the time Harlan stopped, breathing like a winded horse, Dred's back was open so deep you could see the white of ribs through torn flesh. Blood pooled on the tobacco shed floor, black in the dim light. Dred collapsed, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. Through the haze of agony, he heard Harlan spit and say, "Next time, I'll make sure you don't get up." They carried him back to the quarters where Aunt Hattie worked her rootwork magic again. But this time, even her herbs and prayers couldn't stop the infection that set in. Fever raged through Dred for 3 days. He drifted in and out of delirium, seeing visions of his grandmother Ajari, of the Middle Passage, of drowned souls reaching up from dark waters. In one vision, Ajari spoke clear as day. "You got 2 paths, grandson. You can die here, broken and forgotten, or you can rise up and become the storm they fear. Choose." On the 4th day, the fever broke. Dred woke weak as a newborn calf, but with something hardened inside him like steel tempered in fire. The old Dred, the one who believed in patience and legal remedy alone, had died in that tobacco shed. What rose up in his place was something both more dangerous and more determined. Harriet came to see him, risking punishment to slip away from St. Louis. When she saw his ravaged back, tears streamed silent down her face. "What he'd done to you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What he done to me is beyond hell," Dred said, his voice quiet but iron hard. "And hell's got a debt to collect." "What you mean?" Dred looked at her with eyes that held the weight of generations. "We gonna sue like we planned. We gonna use they courts and they laws. But Harriet," he paused, choosing words careful. "If the law fails us and when it fails us, I ain't going quiet into bondage. And I ain't letting them sell our daughters into it neither." Harriet knew what he wasn't saying. She could see it in his eyes. The cold calculation, the weighing of consequences, the acceptance of violence as a tool of last resort. "The river remembers," she said, echoing Aunt Hattie's words. "You do what you got to do." That night, alone in his corner of the quarters, Dred made a silent vow. He would pursue justice through law, through the courts that claimed to offer equal protection. But if justice failed, then he would become justice itself. Outside, the Missouri night pressed close. Somewhere in the distance, the Mississippi River flowed dark and deep, patient as eternity, waiting for whatever sacrifice the future held. And in the slave quarters, the spirituals took on new meaning. "Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me, and before I'd be a slave I'd be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord and be free." But Dred added his own silent verse. "And if they try to keep me chained, I'll drag 'em down to meet my grave, down in the river, deep and cold, where drowned souls sing and revenge grows old." The seed of rebellion had been planted. Now it just needed time to grow. Listen here, child. Sometimes hope grows in the darkest soil, watering itself with tears and blood. By the summer of 1846, Dred Scott had healed enough to work again, though his back would never be the same. Every morning when he rose, the scars pulled tight, reminding him of Harlan's cruelty and his own vow of retribution. But before vengeance, there was law. Before the river's justice, there was the white man's courts. Word had reached Dred through the slave grapevine, what folks called the invisible telegraph, that Peter Blow's sons, Taylor and Henry, was back in St. Louis. These was the boys who'd grown up alongside Dred when they was all young, who'd played in the same Virginia dirt before the world taught 'em they was master and slave. Taylor Blow had grown into a man of conscience, rare as that was. He'd heard of Dred's situation and remembered the strong young man who'd carried him on his shoulders as a child, who'd taught him to fish in Alabama creeks, who'd been more brother than servant in them early days, before the weight of bondage crushed such notions. Dred sought him out one Sunday in St. Louis, finding him at his office near the courthouse. Taylor's face showed surprise, then concern when he saw Dred's condition. Still too thin, moving careful like his body hurt just to breathe. "Dred Scott," Taylor said, standing and extending his hand like Dred was an equal, not property. "I heard you was back in Missouri. Heard it ain't been easy." "No, sir, it ain't," Dred said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "Mr. Taylor, I come to ask for help, not charity, help with law." Taylor listened as Dred explained. The years in Illinois and Wisconsin territory, both free jurisdictions. The legal precedent that residents in free states could establish freedom. The desperate need to protect his wife and daughters from sale or worse. "You understand what you askin'?" Taylor said, leaning back in his chair. "Suit for freedom in Missouri courts? Dred? The odds is stacked higher than the bluffs outside Fort Snelling. Judges here own slaves themselves. Juries is all white men with interests in preserving bondage. I know, sir, but I got to try. My daughter, Lizzie, they threatenin' to sell her downriver to New Orleans. And my back." He turned, lifting his shirt to show the raised scars, some still angry and red. "This is what I get for just existing. If I don't fight now, I might as well lay down and die." Taylor's jaw tightened. He'd seen whipping scars before. Missouri was full of them. But something about Dred's quiet dignity, his refusal to be broken, stirred something in the younger Blow's conscience. "All right," Taylor said finally. "I'll help. I'll talk to some lawyers, see who might take your case. No promises, Dred, but we'll try." 2 months later, on April 6, 1846, papers was filed in the St. Louis Circuit Court. The case was simple in its claim, revolutionary in its implications. Dred Scott and Harriet Scott versus Irene Emerson, petitioning for freedom based on extended residence in free territories. The legal language was dry as dust, but beneath it ran rivers of hope. "Your petitioner, Dred Scott, respectfully represents that sometime in the year 1834, your petitioner was purchased as a slave by one John Emerson, and that said Emerson afterwards took your petitioner from said state of Missouri to Rock Island, in the state of Illinois, and kept him there as a slave until the year 1836. Word spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. Dred Scott was suing for freedom. Some folks whispered prayers of support, others shook their heads, knowing how such audacity usually ended, with the auction block or the noose. Harlan heard about it too, and his rage was a terrible thing to witness. He confronted Dred at the plantation one evening, as Dred was hauling water from the creek. The overseer was drunk, which made him more dangerous. Whiskey stripped away what little restraint he possessed. "You think you smart, boy?" Harlan spat, his breath reeking of rot gut. "Filing papers in court like you somebody? Like you got rights?" "I got the right to petition," Dred said carefully, keeping his voice neutral. "It's legal." "Legal?" Harlan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I'll show you what's legal." He pulled Old Testament from his belt. Other slaves, seeing what was coming, scattered like leaves before a storm. Nobody wanted to witness, but nobody could help neither. "You need reminding of your place," Harlan said, circling Dred like a wolf. "Need reminding that all the lawyers and papers in the world don't change what you is. Property. Mine to do with as I please." The whip sang. Once. Twice. But this time Dred didn't strip, didn't bow to the whipping tree. He stood his ground, taking the lashes across his shoulders, his arms, anywhere Harlan could strike through his clothes. "Strip, damn you!" Harlan screamed, his face purple with fury. "No," Dred said, the word coming from somewhere deep and unbreakable. Not this time. It was defiance of the most dangerous kind. In the calculus of bondage, a slave who refused orders was a slave who needed breaking or killing. Harlan knew it. Dred knew it. And in that moment, both men understood they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Harlan raised the whip for a strike that might have killed Dred outright. But Captain Bainbridge, the plantation owner, appeared on horseback, drawn up short at the scene. "Harlan, what in damnation is going on?" The overseer lowered his whip, but his eyes promised this wasn't finished. "Just correcting a disobedient slave, sir." Bainbridge looked between them, seeing the tension thick as smoke. "I heard about Scott's lawsuit. Leave him be for now. If the court rules against him, you can beat him all you want. But if we damage valuable property before trial, Widow Emerson might have our hides." It was the cold logic of ownership, not mercy, but it stayed Harlan's hand for the moment. As the overseer stalked away, he paused to whisper in Dred's ear, "When the court throws out your case, and they will, I'm gonna make you wish you was never born. Gonna beat you so bad your own wife won't recognize the meat that used to be your back." Dred met his eyes without flinching. "We'll see who's wishing what when the dust settles." That night, back in the quarters, Aunt Hattie prepared a mojo bag for Dred. A small leather pouch filled with roots, graveyard dirt, and written prayers. "You carry this," she said, pressing it into his palm. "Protection against enemies. And Dred." She leaned close, her ancient eyes reflecting firelight. "The court case is good. Fight that fight, but prepare for the other fight too. The river's waiting. You understand?" He understood. The lawsuit would take months, maybe years. In the meantime, Harlan would make his life hell. And if the court ruled against him, when it ruled against him because deep down Dred knew the odds, then the choice would come. Submit to bondage forever, or take justice into his own hands. Dred tucked the mojo bag inside his shirt, feeling its weight against his chest like a second heart beating. Outside, the Missouri night was thick with cicada song and the distant rush of the great river. Somewhere between the courthouse and the riverbank, between law and vengeance, Dred Scott's fate was being written in blood and water. The trial was scheduled for June. Summer was coming, and with it a reckoning that would echo through history. But first, there would be more pain. There would be the whip's worst song. There would be ribs cracking like kindling and hatred burning hotter than August sun. Hold tight, child. The story's about to turn darker still. Now listen here, child. And listen good. What I'm about to tell you is the darkest chapter in this dark tale. The kind of suffering that changes a soul forever, that turns a man from believer in mercy to instrument of vengeance. This is where Dred Scott crossed the threshold from which there ain't no returning. The first trial came in June 1846, and it was a disaster. The judge, a slave-owning man named Alexander Hamilton, ruled against Dred on a technicality. The lawyer couldn't prove proper documentation of Widow Emerson's ownership. Just like that, hope was dashed on procedure, on paperwork, on the white man's maze of legal manipulation. But Taylor Blow wasn't done. "We'll appeal," he told Dred. "File again with better documentation. This ain't over." For Dred, though, it felt over. He returned to the plantation defeated, his spirit as bruised as his body. And Harlan was waiting like a spider in its web, hungry and patient. The overseer had been nursing his grudge all through the trial, forbidden by Captain Bainbridge from touching Dred while the case was active. But now the leash was off. It was an August morning, the sun already brutal at 8 o'clock when Harlan came to the field where Dred was chopping weeds between tobacco rows. The other slaves saw him coming and scattered, knowing what was about to happen. "Scott!" Harlan's voice cut through the humid air. "Captain says you've been working too slow, losing time daydreaming about freedom you ain't never gonna have." Dred straightened, his hoe in hand, meeting Harlan's pale eyes. "I've been working steady, same as always." "You calling me a liar?" It was a trap plain as day. Agree and use admitting disobedience. Disagree and use calling the overseer a liar. Either way led to the whip. I ain't calling you nothing, sir. Just stating what I know to be true. Harlan's face twisted with that familiar rage. Strip off that shirt. You're gonna learn your place once and for all. Two field drivers, enslaved men forced to enforce the overseer's will or face punishment themselves, grabbed Dred's arms. He didn't resist. What good would it do? They dragged him to the whipping tree, that scarred oak that had drunk so much blood over the years. But this time was different. This time Harlan didn't just want to punish. He wanted to destroy. They tied Dred's wrists high, stretching him up till his toes barely touched ground. Then Harlan did something he'd never done before. He ordered the drivers to tie Dred's ankles too, spreading them wide, maximizing the exposure of his back and sides. You thought you was something, Harlan hissed, circling Dred like a vulture. Filing lawsuits, talking to white lawyers, acting like you got rights. Time to beat that notion out permanent. The first lash of Old Testament came down with such force it knocked the breath from Dred's lungs. The second opened old scars that had barely healed. By the fifth, blood was running down his back in rivers. But Harlan didn't stop at 10, didn't stop at 20. He beat Dred with a fury that went beyond punishment into territory of murder. 50 lashes, then 60, then more. The count was lost in the horror of it. When the whip finally stopped singing, Dred hung limp, consciousness flickering. His back was ruins, flesh torn away in strips, old scars reopened and new ones laid over him, and worst of all, through the gore and blood, you could see white, bone. Harlan had beaten him so bad his ribs was exposed, the curved lines of him visible through torn meat. "Cut him down," Harlan ordered, breathing hard, his shirt soaked with sweat and blood splatter. When they cut the ropes, Dred collapsed like a puppet with strings cut. He lay in the dirt, barely breathing, blood pooling beneath him. "Leave him," Harlan said. "Let him crawl back to the quarters if he can. If he dies, he dies." But Dred didn't die. Old Solomon and two other slaves waited till Harlan left, then carried Dred, gentle as handling a broken bird, back to the quarters. They laid him on his stomach on a pallet, and someone ran to fetch Aunt Hattie. The old root woman took one look, and her face went stone cold. "This man passed saving by my herbs alone. This needs stronger medicine." She worked anyway, packing the wounds with poultices made from golden seal, yarrow, and honey. She covered the exposed ribs with cloth soaked in whiskey to prevent corruption. All the while, she sang low in a language older than slavery, calling on ancestors and spirits. For 3 days, Dred drifted between life and death. Fever ravaged him. In his delirium, he saw visions. His grandmother Ajari reaching out from dark water, calling him home. He saw Harriet and his daughters standing on an auction block, crying his name. He saw Harlan's face, pale and smiling, holding a whip dripping blood. On the 4th day, Harriet arrived, having got word through the invisible telegraph. When she saw her husband, she fell to her knees, her hands over her mouth to stifle her scream. "What they done?" she whispered. "Lord Jesus, what they done to you?" Dred's eyes flickered open, unfocused. "Harriet, I'm here, baby, I'm right here. Our daughters..." His voice was paper thin. Don't let him be sold." "I won't. We'll fight, we'll keep fighting the legal way." Something changed in Dred's eyes then. A coldness settled over him like ice on a winter pond. The legal way failed. The court, they don't see us as human. They never will. "Dred, you can't think like that. I saw him, Harriet." Dred's hand reached out, grabbed hers with surprising strength. "In my fever dreams, I saw justice. Real justice. Not the white man's law, but the old law. The river law." Harriet understood. She'd been born in bondage just like him, had felt the whip herself. She knew there was a point where a soul couldn't take no more, where the only choice left was fight or die trying. "The river remembers," she said softly, repeating Aunt Hattie's prophecy. "Yeah, and the river's hungry." That same afternoon, through pain that would have killed lesser men, Dred asked Aunt Hattie for something specific. "I need a workin'. A conjure for strength, for revenge, for justice that the courts won't give." The old woman looked at him long and hard. What you asking for ain't light magic, son. This is dark business. This is blood work. I know. Aunt Hattie sighed, then nodded. She went to her box of roots and bones, pulling out items that made even the other slaves uneasy. Graveyard dirt from a murdered man's grave, red brick dust, black cat bone, and a piece of iron chain link. She mixed these in a small black bag while muttering words in Gula, in Yoruba, in languages that predated the Middle Passage. When finished, she pressed the mojo bag into Dred's palm. This here's a vengeance bag. It'll give you strength when you need it, but it come with a price. Once you use it, once you take a life with hatred in your heart, you tied to that deed forever. You understand? I understand. And you accept? Dred looked at her with eyes that had seen hell and come back changed. I accept. Outside the quarters, thunder rumbled though the sky was clear. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing down heavy with the weight of promises made and fates sealed. 3 weeks later, news came. Widow Emerson had agreed to hire out little Lizzie to a family in New Orleans for the season. She'd be sent downriver in 2 weeks. That was when Dred knew time had run out. The courts had failed. The law had failed. All that was left was the old justice, the kind written in blood and sealed with water. He sent word to Harriet through a trusted soul. Tell her to bring the girls to the creek Sunday. We makin' our move. Harlan had beaten him beyond hell, exposed his ribs to the Missouri sun, broken his body but hardened his spirit into something sharp and deadly. Now it was the overseer's turn to learn what hell truly meant. The river was waiting, and so was Dred Scott, with heavy chains in mind and murder in his heart. Sweet Jesus, child, gather close. This here's the moment when righteousness and rage met at the river's edge, when a man pushed beyond endurance became the angel of death itself. What I'm about to tell you happened on a September evening in 1846, when the Mississippi ran low and slow, its muddy waters hiding secrets deeper than any grave. Dred had healed enough to walk, though his back was a ruin that would never be right. The exposed ribs had scarred over, but every breath reminded him of Harlan's cruelty. That reminder fueled what came next. The plan was simple, brutal, and necessary. Sunday evening, the one-time slaves was allowed to move between properties with passes. Dred made his way to the creek that fed into the Mississippi, the same creek where he'd fetch water daily. He'd told Harlan he needed to repair some broken fence posts near the water, and the overseer, never one to pass up free labor, had agreed. What Harlan didn't know was that Dred had been collecting things. Heavy iron chains from the plantation's old shackles, rusty but still strong, a length of rope, and Aunt Hattie's vengeance bag tucked inside his shirt, warm against his scarred chest. The sun was setting, painting the sky blood red and purple like a bruise. Dred waited by the creek, his heart beating steady as a drum. He'd sent word to Harriet to bring the girls to a safe house in St. Louis, away from what was coming. Whatever happened tonight, his family couldn't be near. Harlan appeared at dusk, riding his horse down the path to the creek. He'd been drinking. You could tell by the way he sat loose in the saddle, by the flush on his thin face. "Scott," he called out, "where's them fence posts you supposed to be fixin'?" "Down by the water, sir," Dred replied, his voice calm as Sunday morning. "Too heavy for one man. Was hoping you might help me drag 'em up." It was a bold request. Slaves didn't ask overseers for physical help, but Harlan, drunk and mean-spirited, liked the idea of watching Dred struggle. He dismounted, tied his horse to a willow, and followed Dred down to the creek bank where thick willows and cypress trees created shadows deep as night. "Where's these posts?" Harlan demanded, squinting in the failing light. That's when Dred struck. He'd been working the plantation for years, built strong from endless labor. His hands was like iron, his arms corded with muscle. When he grabbed Harlan from behind, locking one arm around the overseer's thin neck, Harlan barely had time to gasp before the air was cut off. "What the?" Harlan choked, clawing at Dred's arm. "You remember me?" Dred whispered in his ear, his voice cold as river water. "You remember beating me till my ribs showed? You remember threatening to sell my daughter downriver?" Harlan struggled, but Dred was stronger, fueled by righteous fury and the power of Aunt Hattie's conjure bag burning against his chest. He dragged the overseer toward the water's edge where he'd hidden them heavy chains. "The river remembers," Dred said, repeating the prophecy. "And tonight the river collects what's owed." With one hand still choking Harlan, Dred grabbed the chains with the other. They was old slave chains, iron links heavy as sin, rusty from years of binding human flesh. How fitting that they'd serve this purpose now. He wrapped them around Harlan's neck once, twice, 3 times, the iron links clinking in the twilight. Harlan's face was turning purple, his eyes bulging with terror and the first true understanding of his fate. "You spent years telling me I was property," Dred said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "You said I had no rights. You beat me like an animal. Well, tonight you're gonna learn what it feels like to be helpless, to be drowned in your own cruelty." Harlan managed to break free enough to scream, but they was too far from the plantation, too hidden by the creek's thick vegetation. His cry echoed across the water and died in the cypress trees. Dred didn't hesitate. He pushed Harlan into the creek, following him into the muddy water that came up to their waists. The overseer thrashed and fought, his hands tearing at the chains, but the weight was too much. The iron was pulling him down, and Dred was pushing him under. "Please," Harlan choked, his head breaking the surface for just a moment. "Please, You'll what?" Dred's voice cut through the darkness. "You'll stop? You'll change? It's too late for mercy. You had years to show mercy and you chose the whip instead." He pushed Harlan's head under again, holding it there while the overseer's struggles grew weaker. Bubbles rose to the surface, popping in the fading light. The chains did their work, dragging Harlan down into the muddy bottom where so many secrets already lay buried. It took longer than Dred expected. Drowning ain't quick like the stories say. Harlan fought for every breath, every second of life, his hands scrabbling at nothing, his legs kicking uselessly against the current. But eventually, inevitably, the struggles stopped. The bubbles ceased rising. The water grew still. Dred stood in the creek, breathing hard, staring down at the spot where Harlan had disappeared. He could see the chains lying on the muddy bottom through the murky water, wrapped around a body that would stay there till the river decided to give it up. Justice, old justice, river justice. But now came the hard part, the after. Dred waded back to shore, his clothes soaked, his hands shaken with the aftermath of what he'd done. He looked at his palms in the dim light, these hands that had picked cotton and hauled water and cradled his babies. Now they was hands that had killed. He heard Aunt Hattie's words echo in his memory. "Once you take a life with hatred in your heart, you tied to that deed forever." He was tied now, bound to this moment, this choice, this act of vengeance that couldn't be undone. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Dred's practical mind took over. He had to move fast. Harlan's horse was still tied to the willow. He untied it, slapped its rump, sent it running back toward the plantation without its rider. Let him think Harlan got thrown and wandered off drunk. He cleaned himself as best he could in the creek, scraped mud off his clothes. The vengeance bag against his chest had gone cold now, its work done. As he made his way back to the quarters through the gathering darkness, Dred passed other slaves heading home from Sunday visits. They nodded to him, unseeing, unaware that the man they passed was now a killer, a fugitive, a symbol of resistance that would echo through the years. Back at the quarters, old Solomon looked at Dred's wet clothes and the expression on his face, and he knew. Didn't ask, didn't speak, just nodded once, slow and full of understanding. That night, Dred lay on his pallet, staring at the rough wooden ceiling, waiting for guilt to come. But it didn't. All he felt was a strange emptiness, like a fever finally breaking, like a boil lanced and draining. Outside, the Missouri night pressed heavy and quiet. Somewhere in the darkness, Harlan's body was sinking deeper into the river mud. The chains that had bound so many now binding their tormentor forever. By morning, folks would notice the overseer was missing. They'd search. Maybe they'd find the body. Maybe the river would keep its secret. Either way, Dred knew his time here was finished. He thought of Harriet and the girls waiting in St. Louis. He thought of the legal fight still ahead, the lawsuit that would eventually reach the Supreme Court and shake the nation. He thought of freedom, still distant but somehow closer now that he'd seized his own justice. As dawn broke gray and uncertain over the plantation, dread rose from his palate. His back ached, his ribs throbbed, but his spirit, for the first time in years, felt something close to free. He'd crossed a line tonight, but that line had been drawn in blood long before he was born, drawn by every master who'd wielded the whip, every trader who'd sold human flesh, every system that said one man could own another. Tonight, Dred Scott had erased a small piece of that line, and though he didn't know it yet, his act would become legend in the quarters, whispered in the hush harbors, sung in coded spirituals. Wade in the water, children wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. The trouble had come, and the river had claimed its due. Listen here, child. When you kill a white man in slave territory, you don't wait for sunrise. You move fast, you move silent, and you trust only them that's proven. The invisible telegraph spread word faster than any rider could. Overseer Harlan was missing, and Dred Scott had blood on his hands whether they could prove it or not. By dawn, Dred was already gone from the plantation, moving through the pre-dawn darkness like a shadow. He'd grabbed nothing but the clothes on his back and Aunt Hattie's vengeance bag, still tucked against his chest. The old woman had pressed 3 days' worth of cornbread and dried meat into his hands before he left, along with whispered directions. "Follow the creek north till you hit the big road," she'd said, her ancient eyes reflecting firelight one last time. "There's a white stone marker shaped like a cross. Wait there after midnight. The conductor will come." "What conductor?" "The Underground Railroad, child. You think you the first slave to need disappearing? We've been running folks north for years." Dred made it to St. Louis by midday, slipping through alleys and back streets, keeping his head down. He found Harriet at the boarding house where she worked, caught her eye through the kitchen window. She saw his face and knew instantly everything had changed. That night, after the white folks slept, Harriet bundled up Eliza and Lizzie, both girls silent and frightened but trusting their mama. They met Dred at the arranged spot, a livery stable owned by a free black man named Isaac, who was part of the network. "You the ones?" Isaac asked, his voice low. "The family that needs conducting?" "Yes, sir," Dred said. "How much?" "Ain't about money. It's about freedom." Isaac studied Dred's face, saw something there that made him nod with grim approval. "Heard what you did to that overseer. Some folks gonna call you a murderer. But in my eyes, you a liberator." They left St. Louis hidden in a false bottom of a wagon loaded with hay, squeezed so tight they could barely breathe. Little Lizzie started to cry and Harriet pressed her hand over the child's mouth, gentle but firm. One sound could mean death for all of them. The wagon rolled north through Missouri, each bump and jostle reminding them they was fugitives now. Above them, they could hear Isaac humming a spiritual. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home, I ain't got long to stay here." They traveled only at night, hiding during the day in barns, root cellars, and secret rooms built into the homes of abolitionists, both black and white, who risked everything to move souls toward freedom. These was the stations of the Underground Railroad, and the folks who ran 'em was braver than any soldier. At one safe house in Hannibal, a Quaker woman named Ruth fed them potato soup and bread while her husband stood watch. "Bounty hunter's been through here twice this week," she said quietly. "There's a man named Ridgway, works for the big plantation owners. He's got dogs and guns, and he don't stop till he catches what he's hunting." Dred's blood ran cold. How close? Too close. You need to move faster, get across the Illinois border before he picks up your trail. But faster meant riskier, and risk meant exposure. They were crossing through a dense wood near Quincy when they heard it, the sound every runaway feared worse than death itself. Dogs, hounds baying in the distance, their voices carried on the night wind. "Run!" their current conductor hissed, a young black man named Thomas who knew every deer path through these woods. Run, and don't look back." Harriet scooped up Lizzie, Dred grabbed Eliza, and they ran through the darkness, branches whipping their faces, roots trying to trip them. Behind them, the hounds got closer, their barking mingling with men's shouts. "There's a creek ahead," Thomas called. "Wade in the water, it'll kill your scent." They splashed into the icy stream, the shock of cold stealing their breath. Dred's scarred back screamed in protest, but he pushed forward, carrying Eliza on his shoulders, while Harriet struggled with Lizzie clinging to her neck. The water was waist deep, the current pulling at them. Above, through the trees, they could see torchlight flickering, the bounty hunters getting closer. "Down here," Thomas pointed to where the creek bank hollowed out, creating a small cave hidden by roots and hanging vegetation. "Get in and don't move, don't even breathe loud." They squeezed into that muddy hollow, the four of them pressed together like cargo in a ship's hold. The water lapped at their chests, cold as death. Eliza trembled, her teeth chattering, but Harriet held her close and whispered the softest prayer. Minutes later, the hounds arrived at the creek bank, their noses to the ground, their bodies tense. Behind them came the hunters, 3 white men on horseback, one of them tall and lean with a face like carved stone. "Ridgway. They went in the water," one hunter said, holding a torch high. "Trail goes cold right here." Ridgway dismounted, studied the creek with cold calculation. "They're close. I can feel it. Probably hiding under the bank somewhere." Dred's hand found Harriet's in the darkness. They squeezed tight, both of them thinking the same thought. "If they find us, I'll fight till they kill me. Won't let them take my family back alive." One of the hounds, a big red bone, waded into the creek, splashing toward their hiding spot. Its nose worked the air, sensing something wrong. It was 10 feet away, then 5. Then Thomas, still hidden upstream, did something crazy brave. He threw a rock hard across the creek, making a loud splash on the far bank. The hound's head whipped around, and it took off barking toward the sound. The other dogs followed, and the hunters, cursing, rode after him. "Probably crossed over," one shouted. "Come on." The sounds faded into the distance, but still, Dred and his family stayed frozen in that cold hollow for what felt like hours, not daring to move till Thomas gave the all-clear whistle. When they finally emerged, shaken and half froze, Thomas was waiting. "That was too close. We need to get you across the border tonight. There's a station just over in Illinois. Farmer named Jenkins. He'll hide you till the heat dies down." They made it across the Mississippi into Illinois just before dawn, hiding in Jenkins's barn while the farmer's wife brought hot coffee and blankets. For the first time in days, they could breathe something close to easy. But Eliza, her little face serious beyond her years, asked the question that haunted all of them. "Papa, are we free now?" Dred looked at his daughter, at Harriet holding Lizzie, at the barn walls that was temporary sanctuary at best. "Not yet, baby girl. Not yet. But we getting closer." The truth was more complicated. They was in free territory, yes. But the fugitive slave law meant they could still be captured and dragged back. True freedom was Canada, hundreds of miles north through hostile territory. And back in Missouri, the law was searching for Dred Scott, wanted not just for running, but for the suspected murder of Josiah Harlan. The overseer's body had been found 3 days after the drowning, chains still wrapped around his neck, and every plantation owner in the state wanted blood for blood. Dred had bought his family time with violence, but time was running out, and the road to freedom was still long and treacherous. That night, sleeping in the hay with his wife and daughters close, Dred dreamed of that moment by the river, of Harlan's bubbles rising to the surface. He woke without guilt, only grim satisfaction. The overseer had reaped what he'd sown. And Dred? He was just a man trying to protect his family in a world that said he had no right to him. Tomorrow they'd move again, deeper into free territory, closer to Canada and true liberation. But tonight they was alive together, and free of Harlan's whip forever. That would have to be enough. Now listen here, child. Sometimes the cruelest trap is the one disguised as hope. Dred and his family spent 3 months hiding in Illinois, moving from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the bounty hunters. But legal freedom? That was a different kind of chase altogether. Taylor Blow got word to Dred through the Underground Railroad network. Come back. We're refiling the lawsuit with proper documentation. This time we can win. It was a dangerous proposition. Return to Missouri, to slave territory, when there was a murder investigation and bounty hunters scouring the countryside. But Dred knew the truth. Without legal freedom, they'd be running forever. Canada was safe, but it was also exile from everything they'd known. We go back, Dred told Harriet one cold November night in 1847. We fight this in court. If we win for every enslaved soul in Missouri who ever stepped foot in free territory. And if we lose, Harriet's voice carried the weight of a mother's fear. If they catch you for killing Harlan, they got no proof. Body was in the water 3 days before they found it. Could have been accident, could have been anybody. But the lawsuit, that's got precedent, got law on our side. It was a gamble, but Dred Scott had always been a gambling man when it came to freedom. They returned to St. Louis in secret, sheltered by the Blow family who put up their own property as bond. The retrial was set for January 1848, and this time, the documentation was airtight. Proof of Dr. Emerson's ownership, proof of years spent in Illinois and Wisconsin territory, testimony from witnesses who'd seen the Scott family living as free people in the North. The courtroom was packed when the trial began. White folks curious about this uppity slave who dared challenge the system. Free black folks praying for a miracle. And Dred, sitting at the plaintiff's table in borrowed clothes, his scarred back hidden beneath a clean shirt, looking every bit a man deserving of dignity. Judge Alexander Hamilton presided again, and this time he listened. The lawyer for Dred, a man named Samuel Bay who believed in the cause, argued with passion. This man lived on free soil for over 7 years. By the laws of Illinois, by the Northwest Ordinance, by the very principles this nation was founded on, Dred Scott is a free man. Widow Emerson's lawyer countered with the logic of property. Once a slave, always a slave unless legally manumitted. Temporary residence in free states don't erase ownership no more than taking your horse to Illinois makes it wild. The jury, 12 white men, all of them Missouri residents, deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict that would change everything. We find in favor of the plaintiffs. Dred Scott and his family are hereby declared free persons. The courtroom erupted. Free black folks wept with joy. Abolitionists cheered. And Dred? He sat frozen for a moment, unable to believe the words he'd just heard. Free. After 49 years of bondage, the word tasted strange and wonderful on his tongue. Harriet grabbed his hand, tears streaming down her face. Eliza and Lizzie, sitting in the gallery, jumped and hollered with the innocence of children who didn't fully understand what they'd just witnessed. For 6 glorious months, the Scott family lived as free people in St. Louis. Dred found work as a porter, earning wages for the first time in his life. Harriet took in laundry, choosing her customers, setting her own prices. The girls attended a school for free black children, learning to read and write. It was like breathing after a lifetime underwater. But in Missouri, powerful men don't like their property walking away on technicalities. Widow Emerson, backed by pro-slavery politicians and wealthy plantation owners who saw Dred's victory as a threat to the entire system, filed an appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court. And in 1852, that court, filled with judges who owned slaves themselves, reversed the lower court's decision. The ruling was cold and brutal. Times now are not as they were when the previous decisions on this subject were made. Since then, not only individuals but states have been possessed with a dark and fell spirit in relation to slavery. We will not go forward to give sanction to any rash theory of a law now repudiated by the sovereign authority of the state. Just like that, with the stroke of a pen, Dred and his family was property again. The shock of it nearly broke them. To taste freedom and have it snatched away was crueler than never having it at all. Harriet wept for 3 days straight. Eliza, now 14 and old enough to understand, raged against the injustice. Little Lizzie just asked, "Why do they hate us so much, Papa?" Dred had no answer that made sense. But worse was yet to come. Someone had talked. Someone in the quarters. or maybe one of the safe house operators, had whispered to the wrong person about what really happened to Overseer Harlan. One night, Ridgway, that stone-faced bounty hunter, showed up at their door with 2 deputies and a warrant. Not for murder, they couldn't prove that, but for suspicion of involvement in the death of Josiah Harlan. They dragged Dred to jail, threw him in a cell that stank of piss and despair. For 2 weeks they interrogated him, trying to break his story, trying to get him to confess. "We know you killed him," Ridgway said, his voice flat and cold. "We know you wrapped them chains around his neck and drowned him like a dog. Just admit it, and maybe the judge will be merciful." But Dred, who'd survived the whip and survived the Middle Passage in his ancestors' memory, who'd crossed free states and fought in courtrooms, didn't break. "I was at the quarters that night. Old Solomon and Aunt Hattie will testify to it. You got nothing but suspicion. They couldn't prove it. The evidence was circumstantial: wet clothes, proximity to the creek, motive. But no witnesses, no confession, no smoking gun. After 2 weeks, they had to release him. Still, the damage was done. Word spread through St. Louis. Dred Scott might be a killer. Employers wouldn't hire him. Landlords wouldn't rent to his family. The white folks who'd supported his lawsuit started keeping their distance. Harriet pulled him aside one night, her voice urgent. "We need to run again. Take the girls and head north for real this time. Canada, where the law can't touch us." "No," Dred said, his jaw set stubborn. "We take this higher. We appeal to the federal courts. We make this bigger than Missouri, bigger than one family. We make this about every enslaved person in America." "You're risking everything. We already lost everything." Dred's voice cracked with emotion. "Our freedom was given, then taken back. They tried to jail me for defending myself. What more can they take except our lives? And I'd rather die fighting than live running." So they filed papers with the Federal Circuit Court, which led eventually to the case that would shake the nation: Dred Scott versus Sanford. It would take 5 more years of legal wrangling, of poverty and prejudice, of hope rising and falling like the Mississippi's water levels. But on this night in 1852, sitting in their small rented room with his family gathered close, Dred made a promise that would echo through history. "This fight ain't just about us no more. It's about every soul in chains. If we win, we crack the foundation of slavery itself. If we lose..." He looked at his daughters, at Harriet's tired but determined face. "If we lose, at least we fought. At least we made them see us as human beings worthy of justice." The path to the Supreme Court was paved with broken hopes and betrayals. But Dred Scott would walk it anyway, his scarred back straight, his eyes fixed on a freedom that seemed to move further away the closer he got. Outside, the Missouri night pressed heavy with the weight of destiny. Somewhere chains still rattled, somewhere whips still sang, but somewhere too, in courtrooms and quarters, in hush harbors and hideaways, the seeds of revolution was taking root. And at the center of it all was a man who drowned his oppressor and now aimed to drown the whole cursed system in the waters of justice. Sweet Jesus, child, gather round for the darkest chapter in this nation's legal history. What happened in March 1857 in that marble temple they call the Supreme Court wasn't just injustice. It was the codification of evil, the enshrinement of cruelty in constitutional law. By 1856, the case of Dred Scott had become a powder keg in a nation already exploding over slavery. Kansas was bleeding from border wars between pro-slavery and free soil forces. Congress was fractured, fistfights breaking out on the Senate floor. The whole country was a tinderbox, and Dred's case was the match everybody watched with held breath. Dred himself was nearly 60 now, his body worn down by decades of labor and violence. His back was a map of scars, his hands gnarled like old tree roots. But his spirit? That remained unbroken, tempered like iron and fire. The case had wound its way through the federal system, finally reaching the highest court in the land. 9 justices in black robes, sitting in judgment over whether a black man could be considered a citizen, whether freedom once tasted could be reclaimed. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney presided, a man from Maryland, a former slaveholder who'd freed his own slaves but believed the institution itself was constitutional and necessary. He was 79 years old, ancient and bitter, determined to settle the slavery question once and for all in favor of the South. The oral arguments took place in February 1857. Montgomery Blair and George Curtis argued for Dred, invoking the Northwest Ordinance, the Missouri Compromise, the very principles of liberty the nation claimed to hold sacred. "This man lived on free soil for years," Blair thundered to the justices. "He married on free soil. His children was born on free soil. By what logic can you say he remains property when the law of the land where he resided declared him free?" But the justices, sitting in their high-backed chairs, surrounded by marble columns and the trappings of power, had already made up their minds. You could see it in their faces, the dismissiveness, the cold calculation that this was about maintaining order, not seeking justice. The decision came down on March 6, 1857, and it was worse than anyone imagined. Chief Justice Taney read the majority opinion in a dry, emotionless voice that made atrocity sound like simple legal reasoning. His words would echo through history like a curse. The question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen? His answer was swift and brutal. "We think they are not, and that they are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States." But Taney wasn't done. He went further, driving the knife deeper. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order, and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. Them words hung in the air like a noose. They wasn't just denying Dred his freedom. They was denying the humanity of every black person in America, enslaved or free. They was saying that the Constitution, that sacred document promising liberty and justice, was never meant for folks with dark skin. The courtroom was silent as a tomb. Then, like a dam breaking, the reactions came. Abolitionists wept with rage and despair. Pro-slavery forces cheered, seeing their peculiar institution vindicated by the highest authority. And Dred? He sat there, stone-faced, absorbing the blow that was both personal and universal. Harriet, sitting beside him, grabbed his hand and squeezed so tight her nails drew blood. "They made us ghosts," she whispered. "Told the whole world we ain't even human." But Taney still wasn't finished. He went on to declare the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, arguing that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. It was a sweeping political decision disguised as legal reasoning, and it set the stage for the Civil War that was coming like thunder on the horizon. Two justices dissented, Benjamin Curtis and John McLean, writing powerful opinions that tore apart Taney's logic. But dissents don't change verdicts, and the damage was done. The nation exploded. In the North, newspapers screamed headlines condemning the decision. Frederick Douglass, that great orator and abolitionist, called it a devilish decision. This judicial incarnation of wolfishness. Harriet Tubman, who'd conducted hundreds to freedom on the Underground Railroad, vowed to work twice as hard. The Republican Party, barely 4 years old, made opposition to the Dred Scott decision a central platform. In the South, plantation owners celebrated, seeing the decision as final proof that their way of life was constitutionally protected. Slave prices rose. The auction blocks grew busier. The whips sang louder. And Dred Scott? He returned to St. Louis a broken victor, vindicated in spirit but crushed by law. He was property again, officially and completely. But here's where fate took a strange turn, child. The publicity from the case, newspapers across the nation had covered it, making Dred's name synonymous with the slavery question, brought unexpected help. Taylor Blow, that good-hearted son of Dred's former master, decided to do what the courts wouldn't. He purchased Dred, Harriet, and their daughters from Widow Emerson's family, then immediately manumitted them, gave them legal free papers that even Taney's court had to recognize. On May 26, 1857, just 2 months after the Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott was finally, legally, indisputably free. The irony was bitter as gall. The highest court in the land had declared he could never be a citizen, could never have rights. Yet a private transaction, an act of conscience by one white man, accomplished what a decade of lawsuits couldn't. Dred and Harriet wept when Taylor handed them the manumission papers. Eliza and Lizzie, now grown women who'd spent their lives in legal limbo, clutched the documents like they was sacred texts. "It's done," Taylor said, his own eyes wet. "You're free, Dred. All of you. Nobody can take it back now." But the victory was hollow, tainted by the Supreme Court's declaration that black folks had no rights white men was bound to respect. Dred had his freedom, but millions remained in chains, and the law of the land said they belonged there. That night, free for the first time legally since birth, Dred sat in their small rented room and thought about the journey. The whippings, the ribs split open, the overseer drowned in the river, the years of legal battles, all of it leading to this moment of freedom built on the ashes of judicial betrayal. "We won and we lost," he said to Harriet. "I'm free, but my people ain't. The court said we ghosts, but we still here, still breathing, still fighting." Harriet nodded, her face carved with the wisdom of surviving what shouldn't be survived. "Your name gonna live forever, Dred. Long after Taney's bones turn to dust, folks will remember you stood up and said, 'I'm human.' That counts for something." It did count. The Dred Scott decision, meant to settle the slavery question, instead ignited the fuse that led to civil war. Within 4 years, the nation would tear itself apart. And at the center of that great conflict was the question Dred had forced them to confront. Can a nation conceived in liberty endure half slave and half free? The answer, written in blood across battlefields from Bull Run to Appomattox, would be no. But on this night in May 1857, Dred Scott was just a free man holding his freedom papers, knowing they came too late and cost too much, but treasuring them anyway. "Listen here, child. Sometimes freedom comes too late to heal the wounds bondage carved deep." Dred Scott lived as a free man for only 16 months, and even them precious months was shadowed by the weight of all he'd endured. The summer of 1857 was strange and bittersweet for the Scott family. Dred found work as a porter at Barnum's Hotel in St. Louis, earning 50 cents a day carrying luggage and opening doors for white folks who'd read about him in newspapers, but didn't recognize the famous face. He liked the anonymity, the simple dignity of honest work for honest wages. Harriet took in laundry and sewing, her strong hands that had survived so much now creating beauty, mending torn cloth, embroidering flowers on white ladies' dresses. She hummed spirituals while she worked, her voice carrying memories of hush harbors and midnight prayers. Eliza, now 19, had married a free black man named Wilson Madison, a barber who owned his own shop. She was pregnant with her first child, glowing with the promise of a baby born into freedom. Lizzie, 17, worked as a seamstress apprentice, her nimble fingers faster than anyone in the shop. On Sundays, the family gathered at the small AME church on the north side of St. Louis, where the congregation sang with a fervor born of survival. "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we free at last." But freedom couldn't erase the scars. Dred's back still ached every morning, the exposed ribs Harlan had revealed never healing quite right. He moved careful, like a man much older than his 58 years. His hands trembled sometimes, shaken with memories he couldn't voice. At night, he dreamed of the river, of chains sinking slow through murky water, of Harlan's face pale and terrified, bubbles rising. Sometimes he woke gasping, and Harriet would hold him, rocking him like a child till the tremors passed. "You did what you had to," she whispered in the darkness. "The river remembers, and the river forgives." But Dred wasn't sure he forgave himself. Not for killin' Harlan. That devil deserved what he got. But for the cost of it all. The years of runnin'. The legal battles that had made his name synonymous with slavery's cruelty. The Supreme Court decision that had declared his people less than human. "I broke the system," he told old Solomon one day, visiting the elderly man who still lived in the quarters outside the city. "But I broke myself in the process." Solomon, blind now in both eyes, reached out and found Dred's face with his gnarled fingers. "You ain't broken, son. You bent, like we all bent. But you still standin', and your standin' means something to every soul still in chains." Word had spread through the slave grapevine, that invisible telegraph that carried news faster than any newspaper. Dred Scott had faced down the Supreme Court. Dred Scott had drowned his overseer. Dred Scott had survived and won his freedom. In the quarters, his name was whispered like a prayer, like a promise. But freedom couldn't heal tuberculosis. The sickness came slow at first. A cough that wouldn't quit. A tightness in his chest that made breathing hard. By autumn, Dred was losing weight, his strong frame shrinking till his clothes hung loose. By winter, there was blood in his sputum, bright red against white cloth. The doctor, a kindly white man named Stevens who treated free black folks, shook his head grave-like. "Your lungs is damaged, Mr. Scott. Too many years of hard labor, breathing in tobacco dust and cotton fibers. I'm sorry, but there ain't much I can do." "How long?" Dred asked, his voice steady despite the fear clenching his heart. "Months, maybe. Hard to say. You need rest, good food, clean air." But rest was a luxury Dred had never known, and clean air was scarce in the industrial smoke of St. Louis. He kept working at the hotel, carrying bags till his strength gave out, refusing to die idle. Harriet tried everything. Herb teas from Aunt Hattie's old recipes, poultices on his chest, prayers that rose like incense. But tuberculosis was a thief that couldn't be bargained with, a reaper that came for rich and poor alike. By March 1858, Dred knew he was dying. He could feel it in his bones, in the way each breath was a struggle, in how the world was growing dim around the edges. He called his family together one Sunday after church, Harriet, Eliza with her swollen belly, Lizzie and Wilson. "I need y'all to know something," he said, his voice thin but firm. "What I done, the lawsuit, the fightin', it wasn't just for us. It was for all of us, every soul in bondage." "We know, Papa," Eliza said, tears streaming in down her face. "The court said we got no rights, but they was wrong. We human. We got dignity, love, hope. They can't take that with laws and whips." He paused, coughing into a cloth that came away bloody. "There's a war coming. I can feel it. The nation can't hold together, half slave and half free. When it comes, when the blood flows, remember, every drop spilled is paying a debt that should never have been owed." "Don't talk like that," Harriet pleaded. "You ain't going nowhere yet." But they both knew better. Dred spent his last days in their small rented room, propped up on pillows, watching spring sunlight stream through the window. Visitors came. Taylor Blow, who'd given him freedom. Samuel Bay, the lawyer who'd fought for him. Former slaves who wanted to touch the hand of a legend. On September 17, 1858, as summer faded into autumn, Dred's breathing grew shallow. Harriet held his hand, singing soft the spirituals they'd shared in bondage. "Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home." "You think Grandmama a Jerry waitin' for me?" Dred whispered. "I know she is. And all the ancestors, all the souls that crossed the Middle Passage. You gonna join 'em free at last." "Free at last," Dred echoed, a smile touching his lips. He died peaceful, surrounded by love, his scarred back finally at rest. The newspapers carried his obituary, some respectful, some dismissive, all acknowledging that Dred Scott had been more than property, more than a legal case. He'd been a man who'd fought for his humanity and lost in the courts but won in history. They buried him in Wesleyan Cemetery in St. Louis, in a grave marked only with a simple wooden cross. No grand monument, no marble angel, just earth and memory. But his legacy? That was written in the hearts of every person who'd heard his story. In the slave quarters, they sang new spirituals with his name woven in. In abolitionist halls, They invoked his case as proof the system was rotten to its core. In the South, plantation owners felt the first tremors of the earthquake coming. Harriet stood at his grave after the funeral, her daughters beside her, and she spoke words that would echo through the years. He was property once. He was beaten, starved, degraded, but he never stopped being a man, never stopped believing we deserved freedom. That belief, it's gonna outlive all of us. She was right. Within 3 years, the Civil War would explode, and the question Dred had forced the nation to confront would be answered in blood and fire. Within 7 years, the 13th Amendment would abolish slavery forever, and Taney's cruel words about black folks having no rights would be dust in history's mouth. Dred Scott died before seeing that victory, but he'd planted the seeds. His life, his suffering, his refusal to accept bondage, all of it watered the tree of liberty with blood and tears. And deep in the Mississippi, chains still rested on the muddy bottom, a testament to one man's vengeance and a nation's shame. Now, listen here, child. Death ain't always an ending. Sometimes it's the spark that lights a fire that burns down empires. Dred Scott's body was barely cold in the ground when his name became a battle cry, a rallying point for the storm that was gathering over America. The year was 1859, and the nation was a powder keg with a lit fuse. John Brown, that wild-eyed abolitionist prophet, had just raided Harper's Ferry trying to spark a slave uprising. They caught him, tried him, hanged him, but his last words echoed like prophecy. The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. In the slave quarters across the South, Dred's story had grown into legend. The truth of what happened to Overseer Harlan had leaked out through the invisible telegraph, and slaves whispered about it in the darkness, their voices carrying hope and warning in equal measure. "You hear about Dred Scott?" an old field hand named Moses would say to the younger ones. "Beat so bad his ribs showed white through torn flesh. But he didn't bow. No, sir. He took them chains that bound us and wrapped him round the devil's neck, sent him down to the river where all debt gets paid." The story changed in the telling, as stories do. Some said Dred had conjure power from root women. Others claimed he could walk through walls that bullets couldn't touch him. The truth didn't matter as much as what the truth represented. Resistance, vengeance, the refusal to accept bondage as eternal. Harriet, still living in St. Louis with her daughters, heard these stories and smiled sad-like. She knew the real Dred, not the legend, but the man. Scarred, tired, haunted by what he'd done but unrepentant. She kept his memory alive in her own way, telling true stories to anyone who'd listen. He was just a man, she'd say, but sometimes one man standing up is all it takes to make the whole rotten structure shake. That structure was indeed shaken. The Dred Scott decision, meant to settle the slavery question forever, had instead deepened the divide. Northern states grew more defiant, passing personal liberty laws that nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. Southern states grew more paranoid, seeing abolitionists behind every criticism, every challenge to their peculiar institution. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president on a platform that opposed slavery's expansion. He'd invoked the Dred Scott case dozens of times in debates, calling it a moral, social, and political evil. South Carolina seceded within a month. 6 more states followed. By April 1861, Confederate guns were firing on Fort Sumter, and the war Dred had predicted on his deathbed was a bloody reality. In the quarters, the news spread like wildfire. The master's world was tearing itself apart, and in that chaos, opportunities bloomed. Thousands of slaves ran for Union lines, seeking freedom in the confusion of war. Others stayed behind, engaging in subtle sabotage, tools broken, crops burned, information passed to Union scouts. Eliza, Dred's eldest daughter, became a conductor on the Underground Railroad during the war years, guiding refugees north through the same routes her father had traveled. She carried a small portrait of Dred in her pocket, touching it for strength when the journey got hard. "This here's my papa," she'd tell frightened runaways waiting in safe houses. "He fought the Supreme Court and lost, but he won anyway. He showed 'em we human, we got rights, We deserve freedom. You running tonight? You running on his shoulders. The war dragged on. Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam. Rivers of blood, mountains of corpses. The nation was paying in gore for the sin of slavery, and every death seemed like payment on a debt that could never be fully settled. In September 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that slaves in rebel states would be free come January 1st, 1863. When that day arrived, when freedom became federal law in the Confederate territories, celebrations erupted in black communities across the North. Harriet gathered her daughters and grandchildren. Eliza had 3 now, all born free, and they held their own jubilee in their small St. Louis home. "Your grandfather lived to see this coming," Harriet told the children, tears streaming down her weathered face. "He died before it arrived, but he knew. He knew the chains couldn't hold forever." But freedom during wartime was complicated, messy, violent. In the South, plantation owners who hadn't fled tried desperately to keep their slaves ignorant of the proclamation. Union soldiers who liberated plantations sometimes found slaves who'd been hiding in swamps and woods for years, surviving on roots and prayer. And in them swamps, in them hidden places, the story of Dred Scott had taken on mythic proportions. Some former slaves claimed to have seen his ghost walk in the riverbanks at night, chains in hand, hunting for cruel overseers. Others said his spirit possessed them with courage when they ran, that they could hear his voice whispering, "Run, child, run toward the North Star." The legend served a purpose. It gave the powerless a hero, someone who'd stood up and struck back. It didn't matter if the details was embellished and the core truth remained. Dred Scott had been beaten beyond hell and had dragged his tormentor to hell with him. By 1865, the war was ending. Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April. Lincoln was assassinated days later, robbing the nation of the one man who might have guided a just reconstruction. But the 13th Amendment passed in December, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. Harriet lived to see it, to hold that newspaper announcing slavery's end, to weep over words she couldn't read but understood in her bones. "We did it, Dred," she whispered to the small portrait she kept by her bed. "It cost everything. Cost you your health, cost the nation 500,000 dead. But we did it." She died in 1876, 18 years after her husband, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd never known chains. They buried her beside Dred in Wesleyan Cemetery, their graves side by side like they'd stood in life, partners in struggle, united in purpose. But the story didn't end there. In the quarters, in the freedmen's schools, in the churches where former slaves gathered to worship in their own way, Dred's name lived on. Preachers invoked him. Teachers used him as an example. Griots wove him into the oral history of resistance. "Remember Dred Scott," they'd say. "Remember he fought with law when law would listen, and with chains when law failed. Remember he showed us we human, we got dignity, we deserve justice." That's the legacy, not in marble monuments, but in the blood and bones of freedom. And deep in the Mississippi, where catfish swam through silt and secrets, them chains still rested on the bottom, a memorial to one man's vengeance and a nation's long-delayed reckoning. Sometimes on quiet nights when the river ran low, folks swore they could hear 'em rattling, a sound like judgment, like prophecy, like the chains of bondage finally breaking for good. The war had ended. Slavery was dead. But the fight for true equality? That was just beginning. And Dred Scott's ghost was marching at the front of that long, bloody column toward justice. Listen here, child. Justice don't flow smooth like honey. It flows like a river after a storm, violent and muddy, tearing down everything that stood in its way, carrying debris and bodies in its current. The years after the war was like that, a flood of change that destroyed the old order, but left the new one uncertain and dangerous. By 1870, the 14th Amendment had been ratified, granting citizenship and equal protection to all persons born in the United States. It was a direct repudiation of Taney's Dred Scott decision, a constitutional middle finger to the idea that black folks had no rights white men was bound to respect. Eliza Scott Madison, Dred's daughter, was 43 years old when that amendment passed. She stood in her kitchen in St. Louis, holding the newspaper with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as someone read her the words, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States." "You hear that, Papa?" she whispered to the sky. "You a citizen now. Took 'em 12 years after you died, but they finally said it. You human. You got rights. You always did." The 15th Amendment followed in 1870, granting black men the right to vote. Not women yet. Harriet had died still unable to cast a ballot. But it was progress, slow and bloody, but progress nonetheless. Dred's grandchildren grew up in this new world, strange and dangerous. They attended freedmen's schools, learned to read and write, carried themselves with a dignity their grandparents had to fight for. They heard stories about Dred Scott. Not just the legal case that made newspapers, but the whispered truth about what happened to Overseer Harlan. "Your great-granddaddy was a warrior," Eliza told them. "Not with guns and swords, but with courage. When they beat him till his ribs showed, he didn't break. When the court said he wasn't human, he proved them wrong just by standing up." The legend had spread far beyond Missouri. The Mississippi Delta, in the Sea Islands of Georgia, in the tobacco fields of Virginia, freed people told the story of Dred Scott, changing it to fit their own experiences but keeping the core truth. Resistance is possible, vengeance is righteous, and the river always collects what's owed. In some tellings, Dred became a hoodoo man who called spirits from the river to drag slaveholders down. In others, he was a Moses figure who led his people through legal wilderness toward the promised land. The truth and the myth blended together like mud and water, inseparable and powerful. But the backlash was brutal. White Southerners, unable to accept the new order, formed terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, riding at night in white robes, burning crosses and lynching black folks who dared claim their rights. Reconstruction governments was overthrown by violence and fraud. Jim Crow laws sprang up like poisoned weeds, creating a new system of oppression to replace the old. In 1883, the Supreme Court, the same institution that had declared Dred less than human, gutted the Civil Rights Act of 1875, saying the 14th Amendment didn't protect black folks from private discrimination. The river of justice was running backward, flooding over the gains that had been won in blood. Eliza watched her world constrict again, saw her children and grandchildren denied opportunities despite being free. She'd thought freedom was the end, but it was just the beginning of a different fight. What would Papa do? Her youngest grandson, named Dred after his great-grandfather, asked her one night after being denied entry to a white school. Eliza thought long about that question. "Your great-granddaddy fought 2 battles," she finally said. "One in the courts, which he lost. One by the river, which he won. He'd tell you to fight both ways. Legal when you can, direct when you must. But most important, he'd tell you to never accept that you less than human, no matter what no court or law or white man says." The story of what happened to Harlan had become a kind of touchstone in the community. Elders would tell it to youngins who was getting discouraged, who was starting to believe the white man's lies about black inferiority. Harlan thought he was untouchable, they'd say. Beat that man till his ribs showed through torn flesh, thought he'd broken his spirit. But Dred wrapped them slave chains round that devil's neck and sent him to meet his maker. You remember that when they try to tell you powerless? You remember the river remembers. In 1896, the Supreme Court delivered another devastating blow. Plessy v. Ferguson, establishing the doctrine of separate but equal that would justify segregation for decades. The justices who wrote that opinion was long removed from Taney, but they might as well have been his disciples, finding new ways to say black folks didn't deserve full citizenship. But something had changed in the 60 years since Dred filed his first lawsuit. Black communities had institutions now. Churches, schools, newspapers, businesses. They had leaders like Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells who articulated their demands with power and eloquence. They had a collective memory of resistance that included Dred Scott's name alongside Nat Turner's, Harriet Tubman's, Denmark Vesey's. Young Dred, Eliza's grandson, grew up to be a preacher, and he always included his great-grandfather in his sermons. Dred Scott showed us that the law ain't always just, but justice is always right. He'd thunder from the pulpit. He fought in courts that said he wasn't human. When courts failed, he took matters into his own hands. We honor both struggles, the peaceful and the violent, the legal and the direct. Freedom is a river that flows through many channels. The ripple effects continued. Every time a black person stood up to injustice, they was standing on Dred's shoulders. Every lawsuit challenging segregation referenced his case as an example of judicial failure that had to be corrected. Every act of resistance, from the Montgomery bus boycott to the Greensboro sit-ins a century later, carried his spirit. And in the quarters, which was now called neighborhoods but still suffered from the same poverty and oppression, the old folks still told the story their way, about a man beaten beyond hell who dragged his tormentor to hell, about chains that sank in the Mississippi carrying not just an overseer, but the weight of bondage itself, about a river that witnessed atrocity and delivered justice when courts wouldn't. The Mississippi still runs, they'd say, still carries secrets in its muddy waters, still remembers every drop of blood, every tear, every chain that's ever touched its surface. One day, that river gonna rise up and wash away all the sin that's been committed on its banks. You watch. The river remembers everything. Eliza died in 1912, having lived to see automobiles and electric lights, but also Jim Crow and lynchings. Her last words, spoken to young Dred, who held her hand, was simple. Tell the story. Don't let him forget. Your great-granddaddy was human. He was mighty, and he fought. Tell it true. And he did. And his children did. And their children did. Passing down the tale through generations, keeping Dred Scott alive not in marble monuments or history books, but in the oral tradition where truth and legend merge into something more powerful than either alone. The river kept flowing, justice kept struggling toward realization, delayed but not denied. And somewhere in the depths of the Mississippi, rusted chains lay buried in silt, a testament to one man's refusal to accept bondage, one man's act of vengeance that became a symbol of resistance for millions. The fight wasn't over, but it continued, and Dred Scott's name was a battle cry that echoed through the decades, a reminder that oppression can be challenged, that the powerless can strike back, that the river, patient and eternal, eventually collects all debts. Now gather round one last time, child, for this is where the circle closes, where past and present meet at the river's edge, where the promise made in blood finally speaks its truth to the future. The year is 1954, 96 years after Dred Scott drew his last breath. A descendant stands at his grave in St. Louis, a great-great-granddaughter named Sarah, who'd traveled from Chicago to pay respects. She's 32 years old, a school teacher, and she carries news that would have made the old man weep with vindication. That very month, the Supreme Court, the same institution that had declared Dred less than human, handed down Brown versus Board of Education, striking down the separate but equal doctrine that had poisoned the nation for 60 years. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote words that finally repudiated Taney's ghost. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Sarah kneels at the weathered gravestone, her fingers tracing the carved letters. Dred Scott, subject of the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in 1857, which denied citizenship to the Negro, voided by the 14th Amendment, died 1858. We won, great-grandfather, she whispers. It took almost a century, but we won. Around her, St. Louis sprawls, a city transformed but still carrying the weight of its history. The auction blocks is gone, torn down, the slave quarters burned away. But the memory, that lives in the bones of the place, in the very soil that drank so much blood and tears. Sarah thinks about the stories passed down through 5 generations, how Dred was beaten till his ribs showed white through torn flesh, how he wrapped chains around his tormentor's neck and sent him to the muddy depths, how he fought in courts that said he wasn't human, how he died free but not vindicated, how his name became a rallying cry for millions. The river still flows nearby, eternal and patient. Sarah walks to its banks after leaving the cemetery, stands where her ancestor might have stood, looks into the brown water that's seen everything and forgotten nothing. An old black man is fishing from the shore, his hands gnarled with age. He looks up at her and nods, recognizing something in her face. "You kin to Dred Scott?" he asks, his voice crackling like dry leaves. "Great-great-granddaughter." "Thought so. You got his eyes, that look of somebody who won't bow." He reels in his line, sets down his pole. "My granddaddy knew him. Said he was a man who proved we human by refusing to accept anything less." "They tried to break him," Sarah says. "They tried. But you can't break what won't bend. And when you push a soul beyond endurance, sometimes that soul pushes back with a fury that shakes the foundations." The old man looks out at the river, his eyes distant. "Story goes, them chains he used on that overseer is still down there, rusting away in the mud. River keeps them as a reminder of bondage, of vengeance, of justice that the law wouldn't give." Sarah feels tears on her cheeks. The Supreme Court finally admitted they was wrong. Took 'em long enough. But your great-grandfather planted seeds that took a century to bloom. Every civil rights victory since his time carries his name in its roots. Every time we stand up and say, "We human, we deserve justice," we standing on his shoulders. The sun is setting now, painting the Mississippi in shades of blood and gold. Sarah thinks about all the souls who crossed the Middle Passage, who survived slave ships and auction blocks and whipping posts. She thinks about Ajari, who lived to whisper freedom into young Dred's ear. About Harriet, who stood beside him through hell. About Eliza and Lizzie, born into bondage but dying free. The promise written in Dred's scarred back, sealed with Harlan's drowning, carried through generations, was this: we will not be erased. We will not accept less than our humanity. We will fight with law when law listens, and with our bare hands when it doesn't. We will survive, resist, and eventually, inevitably prevail. That promise is being kept, slowly, painfully, with setbacks and losses, but kept nonetheless. The chains is breaking, link by rusty link. The river is delivering the justice it always promised. Sarah turns to leave, but the old fisherman calls out, "You tell the story, young sister. Don't let 'em forget. Not the courts that denied us, not the whips that scarred us, not the chains that bound us. But most of all, don't let 'em forget we fought back. We survived, we human. Always was, always will be." "I'll tell it," Sarah promises. "I'll tell it true." She walks away from the river as darkness falls, carrying her ancestors' memory like a torch. Behind her, the Mississippi flows eternal, its waters whispering secrets, its depths holding chains that testify to one man's refusal, one family's endurance, one people's long march toward freedom. The story ain't finished. The fight continues. But Dred Scott's legacy, carved in scars, written in legal history, whispered in quarters, sung in spirituals, passed down through blood and memory, that legacy is unbreakable. They tried to say we had no rights white men was bound to respect. Dred Scott proved them wrong. Not in the Supreme Court of 1857, but in the court of history, in the hearts of millions who heard his story and said never again. The chains is breaking, child. Can you hear 'em? That rattling sound in the depths, that echo through the years. That's freedom ringing, justice flowing, promises kept. Who suffered, suffered deep and long. Who resisted, left their mark upon the earth. Who fought, changed the course of rivers and nations. And who remembers, we remember. We carry their names, their stories, their refusal to be less than human. The waters still run, the memories still speak, and the truth still lives, passed from mouth to ear, from elder to child, from the dead to the living. This here story of Dred Scott, who was beaten beyond hell, who drowned his oppressor in righteous fury, who stood before the highest court and said, "I am human," even when they denied it. This story lives forever in the files of slavery.